Thank you for joining me on episode 3 of the Security Nurse Podcast. My guest today is Tyler Schmoker, a retired Army Combat Arms Senior NCO, former paramilitary advisor and management consultant to Fortune 500 companies. And if you know anything about Tyler, he's a flannel wearing, writing his own script kind of guy. On this episode, Tyler and I talk about the future of manned guarding, integration of AI into security programs, organizational management, and root cause analysis, and how it can strengthen security programs and healthcare organizations. It was a pleasure to talk to Tyler. He is a security industry executive, an avid conservationist, gardener, and mountaineer. We touch on some of his hobbies and how that has strengthened his professional career as well. So thank you again for joining us today for episode 3 of the Security Nurse Podcast. All right. Well, hello, Tyler. How are you doing today?
Fantastic. How about you?
Good. I'm doing well on this cold day. I think we're both in cold areas of the country at this point.
Yeah, I mean, cold, yes, but we've got a little bit of a reprieve. Supposedly it's going to get up to like 37 today, so we're probably even going to go for a walk, but then it's going to dip down to like -8 or something like that.
Oh my goodness. That's what so 30s is a reprieve. That's funny. I think go ahead.
Everything's relative.
Yes, yeah. And I was thinking about this last night too. We'll jump into more of this, but for some reason your clover front yard jumped to my memory last night, and I was wondering, and I was wondering how it's doing under all the snow.
So actually we haven't had a lot of snow this winter, and you can still kind of see the ground underneath. I will say this though, the clover stays green a lot longer than everyone else's lawns. And like last year with drought and the year before, I mean, I did a video and did a post about it last year where it's like I panned from our upstairs window and came across and all the brown lawns and then ours. It's like, well, who's the weirdo now?
No, I love it. I'm totally I was debating on doing it. And then when I saw that post, I was like, okay, I'm for sure doing it now.
Yeah.
So, and I mean and we'll get more into that, but you definitely have a focus on conservation and your mountaineering and security. And so I'm hoping we can kind of tie that all together. But I had to ask that question because it was burning in my brain. So
yeah.
I wanted to know.
Really, it's all connected. I think that security professionals that are going to be successful in the next couple of decades are the ones who understand how to draw those lines of connections between the world of things and gleaning skill sets from other disciplines, other methodologies that haven't traditionally been applied within a security setting. And so I think that there's just really a lot of opportunity there. And then just on top of that, it's important to have some outlets that have nothing to do with climbing the corporate ladder or winning the next contract. Because, for myself, and I'm actually writing a book about it right now. It's just about done with the first draft. But I started climbing mountains at 37. And at first it was like, well, it's a cool hobby and it's kind of something you can talk about or whatever. And I enjoy it. But the other thing too is that it provided an outlet that wasn't professional, so that when I had setbacks, like in a professional context, say I was the right candidate to get that VP promotion or something like that, and then they went with an outside hire or something like that. After I had these other outlets like gardening, like preserving food, like doing the urban homesteading thing, like climbing mountains and things like that, I didn't get so wrapped up in those things, and I found it made me a better colleague because, we've all known the person. And in fact, at times I've been the person where it's like, well, why does that guy get this and I don't? Or why does this girl get that? I do it. I can run circles around them. And it's like, I let a lot of that stuff go, and I think that it made me a better colleague, and I just I flow with my own seasons now and do my own thing. It's like, I know that, all harvest and all yield what I sowed in the right time, and it has nothing to do with what anyone else has got going on.
Yeah, no, that's completely true. And I lived in Colorado for a little bit, so I'm familiar with like I did the Manitou Incline, the
Mm-hmm.
sand dunes.
Mm-hmm.
I never did a 14er. My asthma, I could that was a little unrealistic, but doing the sand dunes and climbing 2,000 feet of elevation within, an hour's worth of time and doing all of that, and it definitely gives you kind of a different outlook on
Mm-hmm.
things. And that's one of the questions like I had for you and I really wanted to talk about. I'm curious, like, kind of how, I know you have a military background, so how
Mm-hmm.
did you really kind of get into security, and then at what point did you start implementing kind of those hobbies? Was it while you were still in the military or out of the military? How did that kind of
Absolutely not.
transpire?
I wish I'd started healthy hobbying 10 years before I did, to be quite honest with you. So, my military career was, I would say that my military transition in some ways was tough because they all are, and there's like a lot of talk about it on social media and stuff, and you lose identity and you have to start over, and even though you're qualified and did all these things, you have to reset your expectations. All of that stuff happened for me as well, but as a disclaimer, so I did my first 4 year enlistment on active duty, did some overseas time, some forward areas, some stuff like that, and then I transitioned into the National Guard, but this was, shortly after the push into Iraq. Afghanistan had been happening for a while. So getting into the National Guard between training missions, state mobilizations, and then deployments overseas as well. For all intents and purposes, I made a living off of doing Army stuff and then kind of fit in semesters on GI Bill when and where I could, but a lot of that got disrupted. But I made a living off of professional soldiering exclusively for like the first 9 years of my career. And then I was able to get to a point where I was able to be a little bit more of a traditional type of National Guardsman reservist, whereas, the 1 weekend a month and the training exercises were never 2 weeks a year. I know the videos say that, but that's not true. I mean, you're going to do a month and a half of training exercises every year, and that's on top of like the weekend drills or whatever. But it did provide me an opportunity to kind of have a soft landing into, I won't say corporate security, but when I was overseas on a deployment, and really even before that, I'd been on a mobilization. I was part of the quick reaction force to the Superdome before landfall of Katrina. So I was in the Superdome when that hit, and then was involved with the evacuation of all those folks. And then we did about 4 or 5 month operations, something like that, basically through the end of the year in New Orleans, a combination of mobility missions, security missions. But when I did that, Blackwater was still in business as its principal entity then. And so they were down there doing security for like corporate clients and those types of things. And you saw the people with the 511 cargo pants at the time that were so cool, and they were wearing polos and all this other stuff, and they had their M4s or whatever. It's like, so as a young soldier kind of leading my people, it's like you see that, it's like, man, that looks cool. They're driving around in blacked out Tahoes and stuff like that. And then after New Orleans, I ended up getting a call from a National Guard unit, and they said, hey, we see your background, you kind of check a lot of blocks for us. Would you be interested in considering going on a mobilization as kind of like I won't say a special unit, not like special operations, but a special unit. But it was a joint task force that took in a bunch of people from different places that had specific skill sets to serve a certain mission, as opposed to just mobilizing a unit. And so they asked me, would you consider doing that? You kind of meet our profile for this. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll go. And the guy stopped for a minute. He's like, so you mean you'll think about it? It's like, no, I'll go. When are we leaving? And so I in my 20s, I kind of went from either forward area or mobilization or deployment pretty much just nonstop for most of my 20s. And so when I was in Iraq, that was kind of towards the tail end of my 20s. Again, I was in kind of like an unconventional type of military deployment where we're very closely embedded with civilian agencies. I developed and ran local assets. We're paying them with cash and all of this other stuff. It's largely based around surveillance and reconnaissance for like heavy critical infrastructure projects, engineering type of projects. And so doing a lot of operations and intelligence stuff to kind of enable that reconstruction and international development mission. And in doing so, the organization that I was with, they had third-party contracted private military contractors as well. So a lot of like tier one operators, British Royal Marines, SAS, Army Rangers, Special Forces guys, some SEALs, some really top tier guys. And so again, I got to see that example of, well, here's the private military industry, right? And it's like, that would be cool to do that. And it's like, after being around some of these guys, even though, I hadn't been in special forces, I hadn't been a ranger, I had some pretty good experience and I had some pretty decent credentials. I was really fit, had some good mobilization and operational experience. It's like, I think I can meet this profile. So when I got back home from like a 12, 13 month Iraq deployment, I started thinking about, it's like, I really want to give this a try. I was still in the National Guard at the time, but so I started reaching out, kind of researching different companies and which companies were reputable and stuff like that. Started putting my resume together in a format that, would be acceptable within the circuit, as they called it, private military work. And I eventually got picked up on a contract. So then I, quote unquote, deployed, although it's not really a deployment, I guess, because you're not a military service member. But I deployed on a program to Afghanistan. And it was structured where it was 9-person teams, and you basically had specialties that closely aligned with like a special forces ODA. And then you got embedded with a battalion level unit of the Afghan National Army. They call it a Kandak. And so you were embedded with them. So you would teach them about staff process. I mean, I was in the engineering cell, so I basically had an engineer company of 100 plus, local indigenous soldiers, Afghans in the army. And we did everything from digging fighting positions with bulldozers to removal of ordnance to demolitions to dynamic breaching and just all sorts of things. So I did that on the private military side. And that contract eventually dried up, and I'd worked out one of my buddies and I had already found another gig that we were going to jump onto. And basically we were going to fly out of Kandahar commercial to Kuwait City Airport. And then we were going to be able to fly commercial right into Baghdad and then go on to like an intelligence contract. And so this was all lined up. We're ready to go. And then my missus, she's like, I know you've got this other job or whatever, and it's, good money. I mean, I was in my late 20s making making six figures, into the six figures. So I was well compensated. There's a lot of risk associated with it, but she's like, I think it's time to come back home. So it's like, well, okay, I'm going to come back home. And, I'd already had a bachelor's degree. I think I was finishing up postgraduate work, distance learning at the time. So I was close to a master's degree, and the job market was tough. So it's like 2009. So we're just kind of barely post subprime mortgage housing bubble. The economy's garbage. Yep. And, naively, I thought, well, I've got all this this cool guy experience or whatever, and the doors are just going to open to me. I'm going to get into corporate security, or so I thought. Well, none of that happened.
I'm a little surprised by that, because when I approach, and more in like healthcare security, but when I, started talking to people, they were kind of like, well, you don't have any military background, you don't have any law enforcement background. So I am a little surprised that it didn't just open doors for you.
Well, me too. But in retrospect, I kind of see why it didn't now, having been on the other side of the table. And I've screened a lot of resumes and some of the things that I used to do. And I assume that it's like, clearly you're going to see my awesomeness on a 10-page resume that, you hardly know if it's English. It's like, I've seen some of those things now from candidate resumes. I'm just like, oh my goodness. It's like, I've been working for over 20 years now. I've got a 1-page resume. So
I'm trying to get mine there.
Yeah. Just distill it down to the things that really, really matter, and then include those things that kind of talk about you as a person as well. But So it was a struggle for me for a long time. So I ended up getting my first job at a nuclear power plant for 13.50 an hour. And it was a competitive process. I remember going out to the job fair and they were hiring for a lot of different positions. So it wasn't just for the security officer roles, but so there's like thousands of people out at this thing. So it wasn't like I just went for a standard interview. It was like a cattle call.
Yeah.
And if I understand it right, there was something like 600 or 700 applicants, and it was like 20 positions. And of
Oh,
those, I
wow.
think like only 7 or 8 were full time positions, and the rest of them were like contingent or something like that. I ended up getting one of those positions, so that's where my background kind of did stand out, and it opened a door. But it just so happened that the door that it was opening was, I was an E7 in the National Guard, multiple forward area combat deployments, a graduate degree, and I was making 13.50 an hour.
Yeah, I was gonna, how did you kind of wrap your brain around that? Because it's
Not
you
well.
sounds like you went from like six figures down to like to the
Yeah,
13.50 an hour. So
yeah, not well. I
yeah.
mean, and so that's one of those things where, and it kind of ties into what we were talking about at the beginning of this. It's like, I took the job because I'm not just going to sit around. Yeah, I had some money saved up, but we're supposed to be like trying to build a life together and stuff like that. So even if it's not a bunch of money, I'm still going to be a productive citizen and make my 13.50 an hour. I will say though that program that I went through is some of the best pistol craft, like combat pistol training that I've ever got, and the rifle marksmanship and some of the other like physical security type of training and access or in like delay or like physical security delays and all that. I learned a lot about physical security that I didn't know. So that was kind of the flip side of the coin. And so I kind of I tried to rationalize it for myself that I was getting paid 13.50 an hour to get an education. And then eventually I just started transitioning up into other roles. So I wasn't a security officer for years and years and years. I ended up picking up a consulting role within that same firm within a different division. And then I just leveraged that to other opportunities. I would say that, I'd always dreamed of being a soldier, so I'd accomplished that. And then after that, I'd established this crazy dream in my head. It's like, well, I want to be a private military contractor. And even though, I didn't have like a tier one background, so I knew it was going to be a little bit tougher for me to get into that space, but I eventually figured out a way to make it work. I built up my credentials enough so that I met the minimum viable requirements, made connections with the right people, and ended up getting into that community. And again, got some world-class private sector training that a lot of military folks don't even get. And then after that, it's like, well, I want to come home and I want to be able to make decent money and see my wife every night and go out for dinner and stuff like that, and stuff that normal people
Yeah.
do. And so it's like, well, I'm going to get into corporate security. And so I eventually found myself on the services side, starting in manned guarding and just kind of incrementally worked my way up from there, and now I guess I'm working on the fourth generation of that and trying to make a living doing it my own way for myself.
There you go. I love it. So when did the so what are you doing now currently then? So when you say you're trying to make a living for yourself, like what is it that you currently are involved in and doing?
So I left my last corporate role a little bit better than a year ago. So I was a vice president of infrastructure and operations. So I was doing a combination of really industry agnostic tier one integrations, like leading project management, enterprise PMO for a mid-sized organization. But then also I was leading their R&D and DevOps for domain specific security technology. So it kind of really set me down that path, and like how tech enablement and automation of physical security tasks works. And anyone who follows my content knows that I'm a pretty big proponent of downsizing of headcount. And I don't look at it as taking people's jobs. I'm talking about the positions that people don't want, that can't be filled, or they're now cost prohibitive from a labor perspective to a client, but they are not cost prohibitive from a technology perspective. So what I'm talking about is automating those things that don't require fine human logic and fine human motor skills. So there's still a place for highly trained, proficient security officers that are reliable, that have those like soft skills and some of those critical decision-making skills. And then also I think that there's an opportunity for people that have the aptitude for it to start to upskill them so that security starts to look more like, yes, there's a response element where you have people who respond to things, but these are people that are almost more in the domain of they're like a dispatcher slash intelligence analyst slash systems analyst slash operator. So I think that's the point where we get to, we're not talking about, well, guards are commoditized and they're people, so they can't be commoditized. I get all that, but the thing is, we're trying to force a business model on labor that's cost prohibitive to a solution that should be tech enabled at this point. And the thing is, it's tough to fill those positions, but the people who want to be in physical security and have the aptitude, that's how we upskill. And you can have a person who's making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year or more, but they're really working tech enabled like a modern soldier on the battlefield, where it's not so much soldiers out there with rifles. You have more technology. We're seeing it in Ukraine now with like drones and some of these other advancements. It's like there's an immediate overlap in that Venn diagram between military modernization and what I believe should be happening within physical security services, integrated services modernization. And I think that that's the big opportunity. So with that, I had to have some latitude to be able to start talking about those things more openly. And again, anyone who's seen my content knows that I have a firm command of the man guarding business model, both what people see perceptually, but I was an industry insider at a very high level and globally. So I really do understand how the sausage is made. So I'm able to speak now about it's like, look, guys, I know what this really is beyond the marketing collateral and the sales pitches, but here's the opportunity for us to really modernize this thing and not talk about an integrated security solution end to end, but actually have it be an integrated security solution end to end. So I knew in order to do that, I probably wasn't going to be able to be constrained by working for a traditional guarding company, because you do not see guarding people out there now saying the things that I say about it. Because I won't say that it's contrary to the business model. I will say it is a critique of the business model in a sense of, look, everyone, if we do these things, we can really start to elevate this, and we can stop having the same discussions about our people are commoditized. Well, I love the people. I love the security officers. They are not a commodity. They are people. But the business model's become a commodity. We've commoditized ourselves through a business model that is, relatively speaking, non-differentiated within the marketplace, right? There are minor differences, but no one has made any significant advancements. And the thing is, there's a lot of good people out there in physical security as well as on the technology and integration side. There's some very good security systems integration services, and there's some very good technologies out there. The integration between the three is not very good in my opinion. I almost see it as three pillars that are almost in this weird competitive environment rather than integrating. So that's where organizational design comes in. So that kind of leads to the company that I founded Winsley, which is for Win Simply, basically. But okay, it's distilling those advanced, complex problems and concepts down into a simple way so that stakeholders can understand them. So I work a lot in organizational designs with organizations and operating efficiency. And so basically, Winsley is a management consulting company for the security industry. So I draw the distinction that security consultants are going to go out, they're going to assess your cameras, they're going to look at your access control systems, they're going to make recommendations on fences and all of these other things, and they're going to have their CPP, and that's great. We need those people. I can do that too, but that's not really my core focus. It's really around organizational design and industrial psychology and helping CSOs to conceptualize, well, how do I develop an RFP process so that I can get an integrated security solution? Or if a man guarding company reaches out to me and says, Tyler, we really want to get to this point. How do we go through the change management process and the digital transformation part of that? Because a lot of my experience really lied more in enterprise project management and implementations. I've got a bachelor's degree in psychology, so I'm big into the industrial psychology of how these things work. And instead of going to get a CPP, I went and got certified in organizational change management through ProSci. And I did those things for a very specific reason, because I saw that there was a gap in helping the organizations get comfortable with the change, because I don't think it's a case of legacy man guarding companies truly just want to be a pure labor play as a a profit center or revenue driver for the next 20, 30 years. I think anyone who's reasonably smart sees that, we have a population decline. It's getting harder to fill these roles, and labor is just getting so expensive that even if we are paying lower wages than we should to security officers, and there's a bill rate that correlates to that, it's like you can't get it low enough to beat a camera, or you can't get it low enough to beat an intrusion system in some cases. So that's where that offering becomes cost prohibitive. And we have to reach a point where we stop saying, well, how do we get the officer wage lower? How do we say, oh, we only go after this business or that business? It's like, we have to start changing the business model. I look at it in a way, it's kind of like post-industrial agriculture. So in the 1950s, after industrialization, after World War II, America started making more stuff, more manufacturing, those types of things. So people started moving to the city, which means, one, there's less farmers, right? And two, people in the city start having less kids. So eventually we start to go from the baby boomer generation to every generation since then has been smaller. And now we have baby boomers, the biggest generation in modern American history. They are retiring en masse. And guess what? Gen Z, the workforce that's just now beginning to come into the workforce and will be over the next 10 or 15 years, I'm not sure what the cutoff is, they are the smallest generation in modern American history. So we have some real macroeconomic and demographic issues that we as an industry aren't really looking at yet. We're still talking about, we'll pick the right screening questions and we're going to get the best candidates and the best top talent. It's like, guys, we've all got pretty much the same identical Indeed ads. We're not that different, but we're tapping into a pool that is declining. Whereas industrial agriculture in the 1950s and on, and I use this example because I grew up as a farm kid, and I was on a family farm where my dad, myself, and my uncle, we had 3,000 acres, not a small operation, not like big global farm, but also not a small hobby farm. And it was the three of us. But we had proper equipment to the extent that there was automation back then. The automation has improved significantly now with like self-driving tractors and all this other stuff. But that is a way that we were able to continue to meet the demand for production, for food into the marketplace with a limited workforce. We did it through mechanization. We did it through automation. Of the things that it didn't take a human brain and a human sensibility or a fine human touch to do. And I think that that is the best example anywhere in history that man guarding companies can look at and say, well, let's look to 1950s agriculture and how do we start automating that and get over this kind of noble cause that it's like, we're going to keep all the jobs for the officers. Guys, you have open posts and positions people don't want to fill. And if they do, maybe you luck out and get a kid out of the Marine Corps with a bachelor's degree. They're not staying in the role for 6 years. They're going to stay in it for 6 months until they find something better. That is the reality of the marketplace right now.
Yeah, well, and so much there, like lots of thoughts just coming to mind. I mean, you're talking about kind of automation, like a lot of so, from the healthcare security side of things, because it'll definitely overcross here. We now have, like visitor check-in stations, right? So that's all automated. They go in, it's almost like being at the airport. You can scan your ID and then it'll print you out a badge. Whereas before you had a security post where maybe somebody was manning that and checking
sitting there
those
with the
people
cards
in.
and the paper, or maybe they had a spreadsheet and they were checking and who didn't turn in their badge. That's a perfect example of it, right?
Yeah. Or, you have a lot of these now, metal detectors and weapons detections now that's integrating AI and trying to sense, if somebody has something in their pocket. and kind of reducing that screening, having to have somebody there at that screening, or
Hmm.
at least the amount of people, right? So to
Right.
run that efficiently and check each person for a weapon, you're going to need several people at that station. But now
Hmm.
when you have it automated and you have AI kind of helping with that screening and that scanning, you don't have to have as many people there
Right.
to do that.
And that's not to say that. So one of the points of concern, I think, is, because people worry about, like, you see the robots, like I think it was the Deep Robotics, the Chinese robot that they had, like, tearing down the hill, and then, I mean, I think about it too. It's like, imagine a machine gun on that. Imagine if it's AI and it goes into business for itself. Like, that's kind of the Orwellian stuff that's terrifying. So I
Yeah.
mean,
There's
obviously,
American companies with that type of
well,
technology too,
right.
not just Chinese,
No,
but yeah.
no, there are most definitely, but I can tell you, and I don't know if that video, how worked that video is. I think that some
Mm,
of it might be for promotional, and
yeah.
I was very cautious about how I presented. I was like, I don't know how real this is, but it's a, it's for thought. But like, I've seen the Boston Dynamics robot in person at the
Hmm.
demonstrations. I'm not worried about that thing running me down right now,
Yeah.
to be honest with you. I mean, it's a great product, so good on you, Boston Dynamics, but they're going through the iterations and developing this stuff as well. So there's a lot of capabilities. But with that, it's like, what are we doing as far as the brain within that? But like, going to, like, back to your healthcare security context, it's like, we still should have people in loop for all of that stuff. But what it does is, again, using a military terminology, it becomes a force multiplier. So if you're now on the battlefield, or in the hospital, which might be a battlefield some days as well,
Feels like it.
you might have someone who's in a control room that is running all of the virtual tours using cameras that are strategically positioned, instead of having, 3 or 4 guys and gals, like, out hiking around all of the time making $20 an hour, and then whatever the bill rate is on top of that. And if they get hurt because they get bit, then you have work, like workers' comp and all of this stuff that makes it inherently expensive. Yes, you're still going to have that human touch when something happens and you have, an upset visitor or an upset patient, where there has to be that level of human nuance involved and that soft touch to de-escalate those situations. I'm not suggesting that that's going away anytime soon, but
No.
what it does do is, maybe that guard force comes down a bit because you have that person that's using those tech enablers, and they're assisted by AI to recognize things on the tour, on the virtual tour. Maybe it's like a drone enabled tour, whether it's a terrestrial drone or an aerial drone or whatever, but it cues in onto some of those things and brings those to the eye of the operator. It's like, okay, is this a problem? Is this someone cutting the fence on the perimeter, or is this a deer that's out there eating, right? Those types of things. And I think AI is getting better at distinguishing those things. But even if it's kind of a rougher, earlier gen version of it, it drives that stuff to the human decision maker. And then the human decision maker is actioning that, saying, hey, we've got this thing that does look sus. And then that's where you have, like, a response with security officers who have the ability to think critically, take in all the atmospherics of a situation that may be a non-event, or it might be a serious security issue, and what's going on. Is there someone watching over in the parking lot? And so that's what I mean by, like, an integrated security solution and enablement. It's not, we're getting rid of the guards and we're just going to replace them with robots. It's not that simple.
It's not. And you know what? Nurses are kind of worried about the same thing right now because there's also talk of like AI, being used more in kind of the clinical care side of things. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually did a little bit of research because I was really curious because I could recognize. So I'm honestly, I'm excited for it. And I could recognize that AI has been integrated into our process for a lot longer than I think people realize in that
Mm-hmm.
on the clinical side of things. And so I went back and found like there was a Stanford study and an implementation like in the 1970s of using AI to help identify infectious diseases and what antibiotics would work the best for them. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, so we've had some form of kind of AI, and AI is a term that started in the 1950s. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it's been around, it's been kind of slowly integrating itself. I have no fear that, a robot's going to take my job as a nurse. I don't think that's
Right.
coming anytime soon.
Right.
Um, but it definitely is, a chance to enhance, and I think that's what everybody is really wanting, to enhance these processes and enhance these departments and kind of these the flow of things, right?
Right.
So what are some of the challenges you see kind of like implementing these changes? Because I mean the attitude, right? The nurses, you can see the posts, you can see posts from security people. I think from any sector, honestly, when it comes to the talk about AI and taking people's jobs, but not just AI, just in trying to implement like a new procedure, whether it's security or in clinical, there's always pushback and challenges. And to use a term that you use a lot, this is the way we've always done it.
Right.
So, how do you kind of address that from an organizational change management?
So, one of the biggest things with organizational change management from like a true program design and I would say point of rigor is really identifying, what the problem is first. I think for one thing, root causality is lacking sometimes in the security industry. I think there's always a tendency, and I've definitely seen it on the man guarding side, where security officer does something stupid, looking at something they're not supposed to be looking on the computer, on Facebook instead of doing their patrol, or all of these things that not every security officer does it, but sometimes people do those things. And then sometimes a client even catches it, like a client, corporate security counterpart catches it before the service provider. The next thing you know, we're having a meeting where the client's sitting there. Well, this says this in the contract, and what are you going to do to ensure that this never happens again? It's like, well, when you're dealing with people, it'd be pretty disingenuous to say, well, I ensure this will never happen again. If you have 100 people working on the site, chances are it might happen again. You're going to do the scolding. You're going to put out the memo saying you cannot be on Facebook. And someone's still going to try and sneak on Facebook. And then it's going to turn into a cycle of, well, it's because we're only getting $17 an hour, not $18 an hour. And if we get $18 an hour, this goes away. And then the corporate security counterpart goes back and fights to get the $18 an hour. And well, now we got you the $18 an hour, and it's still happening. That's where we're in a kind of a structural, like a business structure for the problem, or business solution is misaligned with the problem on cost and in terms of reliability. So then what happens is a security provider, well, we're going to get with our people, because you're going to have a senior person come out to make the corporate security person feel good about it, a level above the person that they normally deal with. I'm letting the cat out of the bag on this one, right? Because I've been there and I've lived that life. And that person's going to come out and they're going to, we're partners on this. It's all about the relationship. That's one of the big ones that they're going to say. And then it's going to, well, let me get with someone and we're going to get you an action plan on this. Here's the thing that's missing with all of this, though. They commit to an action plan without a root cause analysis. And if that means having an honest conversation about, it's like, well, we have this patrol that's happening after hours where, according to the heat mapping of stuff that happens, nothing really ever happens. So it's super boring. And then it's, well, we have to have the officer there because that's part of our revenue and we have to have it that way. It's like, well, maybe that's one of those things where it's such a low threat. There's low risk of severity or frequency of threats during specific pieces of times or at facilities where maybe it is more suited for like an automated solution that gets it within cost. But instead, we're going down this road of, we're going to come up with an action plan of, we're going to retrain every officer. We're going to send out a memo. We're going to sternly remind everyone about their commitment to their post orders, and that'll do it. And in some cases, well, this is a repeat offender, so we're going to remove that officer and send them to another site, or maybe they'll terminate them. That doesn't really solve the problem, though. If the problem is that the site is, maybe it's so boring and there's really no risk there, but there's always been a security officer there, but you really don't need a security officer to mitigate risk. And in fact, if it's such low operational tempo that you now have physical security people that are quote unquote protecting the site that are disengaged because there's such a low frequency or risk for severity of the risk, that they inherently become less effective because they're still humans and they're bored, right? And they're not engaged in purposeful work. They're just kind of there collecting a check. So those are the conversations then that, you kind of have to have. And it's like, that's tough for a man guarding person to have with a corporate security person. Say, look, maybe this isn't right from a business model perspective. Because they're not going to say, well, reduce our guards or go to someone else. And maybe this corporate security person has enough wherewithal to say, well, what kind of integrated solutions do you have? Maybe we can move this to virtual tours. And do you guys have an offering for that, right? Or they say, well, if you guys aren't going to do this, I'm going to find another guarding company that will. And they're going to come in and it's going to be a honeymoon where they're going to say, well, we're committed to this and company A is bad, but we're different. We do things different because we're company B for all of these reasons on our marketing material, but it's still humans doing human behavioral things. And in that big interaction of like a human performance error, we've gone through cycles of action plans, firefighting, management coming from the office to meet with the corporate security person who's taking time out of their day to manage the security guard force for the provider, as they'll say, rather than working on assessment for Asia Pacific or some other thing that their boss has them doing. And in all of this interaction, it's been a dance where we haven't gotten honest down to the root cause and said, why is this happening? We haven't asked 5 whys of root cause. Instead, we said, well, I'm mad. I understand you're mad. Here's an action plan to make you less mad. And then 3 months, we do it over again. That's kind of the cycle. So where it begins with organizational change management is really getting down to the root causality of what are our real friction points that are causing all of these other things that are happening. And it's not just the client's unreasonable and it's not just the guarding company sucks. In some cases, it's neither of those things. It might be demographics. The labor market is bad, but it's not people just don't want to work anymore. Newsflash. There are less people working and they are not working in entry-level roles. And on top of that, even there's less people to work. That's by demographics. Those numbers are indisputable at this point. On top of that, there's a generational lack of interest in those types of roles. Someone was more keen to come back from the Army in 1960 and take a security officer job and put on the uniform and go to work. People don't want to shave their beards now. People don't want to have to cover a tattoo. They don't want to do some of these basic things, and people just don't want to stand sedentary because we are all used to having information inundated into our brains every day. And some would say that, maybe that's giving us TikTok brain and those types of things. But on the other side of that coin, our workforce and our next generation of workers coming in, they are very tech forward. And they are able to fuse and process information quickly. And we're going to take them and say, well, we're going to put you in a job that was perfectly suited for 30 or 40 years ago, where you don't have any of that. Now you're just supposed to stare into the void. And it's like, so we're taking a bunch of things that are now structurally incompatible. It's like, how do we start to highlight what those issues are to why the business model doesn't work and why it continues to disappoint and why you have a client base for physical security services at an enterprise level saying things like, well, it's filled with dinosaurs. The executives are dinosaurs because they're just giving us the same thing. Or you get into an RFP process and they're saying, well, none of them are that good, but we're going to pick the best one out of the worst. It's like, so for me as a security professional that came from man guarding services, I don't like that. And yes, I'm outside of the industry now, so I think people sometimes think that I'm just trying to poke and jab at it. It's like, I am not, because guess what? That's a big part of my resume too. So that lowers my value. So personally, I don't like it that our industry is perceived that way, because if I removed 9 or 10 years of guard company X and put Deloitte or McKinsey in there, my own earning potential and prospects go up. But if we start to professionalize guarding into truly integrated services, that's where we start to up everyone's value. But we have to go down that path of identifying real problems and then saying, based off of these root causes, we identify the things that we can do, potential courses of action to mitigate that, remedy that short, mid, and long term. And then once we've decided on those things as involved stakeholders on the client side at the executive level within guarding companies, and start to formulate solutions that really address those root causes that make the delivery of the service, the employment experience for the people involved, and the product and the reputation of the product and the service better overall, that's how we start moving things forward, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And as you're talking too, I am getting mental pictures of my 17-year-old son and and trying to expect him to not have some sort of technology to interact with and just sit there. And I think you're absolutely correct and absolutely right on needing to find ways to really move forward and integrate and understand what workforce is coming in, because that's the other thing. I know my son has expectations on the amount of money that he's going to make when he
Mm-hmm.
graduates college. He has very specific expectations, and I think that whole that whole generation, and all of them coming in definitely have, they see TikTok, whatever, they see those influencers, they see the amount of money that some of these people are making doing the things that they're doing.
Small
um,
percentage, but they are there, and they're right in our face.
yeah, no, exactly. And so I think it is going to be a balance between a little bit of culture shock for this
Mm-hmm.
generation coming in. They're going to have a little bit of a reality check. But at the same time, companies really need to understand too the reality of the situation and being able to change and grow and understand that that's what's really going to be needed, in order to bring that workforce in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was the last generation that kind of grew up pre-internet. So I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And then, we got like the slow dial up, when I was in middle school maybe.
The
And
Zennials. We're
yeah,
Zennials.
and I don't think I had probably an email until I was in like my early to mid 20s and didn't use it. And I just started doing social media. LinkedIn's not really social media, but LinkedIn in my 40s. But even I have that expectation too. It's like information's moving fast, and I didn't grow up with that. Like my folks still had the rotary phone with the super long cord that was in the kitchen.
Yep.
And so if I wanted to talk to my girlfriend, I had to stretch that bad boy out as far as I could and be up in the stairwell to be uncomfortable and try and get some privacy. But even I have an expectation for that now. So to assume that we can't adopt some of those things and take them, not just look at some of this stuff as the scourge of how it's going to ruin humanity. It's like, how do we take technological developments to improve our lives overall? That's
Yeah.
what it's all about.
Yeah.
But you're right. Everyone's got to lower expectations a little bit too. Like, again, I came out of, six-figure private military contracting, had a cool guy military resume and all that stuff. And I had expectations for what I was going to make. And I wasted a lot of time not accepting anything else. So I had these stretches of not employment stuff because it's like, do they not know who I am and how awesome I am? But then I just like, you know what? I just got to get out there and start learning and get integrated into some organizations and start working on that like professional capital, and then start compounding interest off of it by meeting people, getting experiences, taking it on to the next, to the next, to the next, and eventually it works out.
Yeah, no, and I like, kind of, and you actually said this earlier too when we were talking of kind of learning, taking kind of maybe the lower paying job, but
Mm-hmm.
learning the skills and building up your skill set for the next thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so even like in your military, when you wanted to do private military, you learned what private military needed. And so built
Mm-hmm.
those skills up while you were still in the military so that when you could move to private military, and then the same thing with manned guarding, starting at 13.50 an hour and learning what those skills were that you needed to kind of just level up to the next level. Right.
Yeah, it's just kind of resetting your perspective of it. And because if you go into it every day saying, I'm too good for this, you're going to be bitter. People aren't going to want to work with you. You're probably going to be a jerk to your boss and not be an employee that they really like. Whereas you kind of just do a reset and say, I'm getting paid for an education right here. And maybe it's not ideal and it's not what I want to be making, but you're compounding that interest, that professional interest. Like compounding interest applies to so many more things than just money. It applies to your skill set. It applies to your network because you start making people, people start to know you, then you meet more people, then you start to get access. And then once you get access, you can make things happen. That's how the world has always worked. And like since kind of the prevalence of social media to scale, where even like, professionals in their 40s like me are now content creators, it's like you're able to do that to scale. And in a way, it's democratizing influence. So, 4 or 5 years ago, nobody in the security industry knew who I was. And outside of engagements that I was working on, it's like I wasn't getting invited to the most important meetings at the Ruth's Chris Four Top, the steakhouse meeting. But now everyone in the industry knows who I am, and they might not all like my content, but if I send a DM up, people pick up the phone.
Yeah. No, and I think that's definitely like important, and and I wish that we would see more of kind of the I don't want to say the lower end of security, but a lot of what you see on LinkedIn is like the C-suite and the managers and that kind of stuff. And even for nursing, like I wish like I saw a lot more nurses on LinkedIn that, were clinical bedside nursing. They weren't necessarily the entrepreneurs or the CNOs and all of them that you see mostly on LinkedIn. But kind of just the clinical bedside nurses, the front line, so to speak, right? And even in security, the front line of security, really interacting and being on LinkedIn, because I think it goes back to learning that skill set, right? Learning what the next step is all about. And so, it's kind of speak to that a little bit. Like, so you got involved with LinkedIn, kind of like you said, later in your 40s. I was kind of the same way. I just got started probably back in 21.
Right.
Is when I
About
kind of
the
really
same time then. Maybe I was 2020, but about the same time, I
okay.
think.
Yep. And so now, how does that really influence, does it even influence kind of your thoughts on security and how you implement things and kind of moving the needle forward?
I think that if I'm going to honestly talk about the power of tech enablement to advance the security industry, I would be a hypocrite if I was scared to post a piece of content on LinkedIn that just wasn't a reshare of great opportunity or, here's me giving certificate to someone else, right? There's so much more than that needs to be talked about. So it's like, well, if I'm really an advocate for tech enablement to scale solutions within the security industry, I recognize that there weren't a lot of people, and there's some people out there that are putting out good content. I would say that I'm probably on the little more, I'm on the edgier side of it within the security industry. But there aren't a lot of people that are having like truly open conversations. It's purely more positioning around how can I get my next role if it's not I'm just promoting my company in this thing and here's me at this banquet, now buy my consulting, right? And it's like, yeah, but that's not really putting anything out in the zeitgeist. Whereas I try and challenge thought because I recognize something that we talk a lot about innovation and vision and strategy in the security industry. And a lot of us are caught in that day-to-day loop where we're exercising in reactive tactics. We say we're proactive, reactive, but then we're firefighting all day, right? And so I think that we've kind of subdued ourselves and it's like, well, I'm busy getting things done or getting her done or whatever, but we're not truly thinking strategically. And so then, but we focus on, well, we're innovative or we're differentiated. Those are kind of favorite words that get used, especially around trying to close an opportunity and say how we're different than the other guys that are not good like us, right? Whatever the product or service offering is. But we're so focused on trying to innovate the individual widget, whether it's a service, whether it's, man guarding or whether it's cameras or whether it's, license plate recognition or facial recognition or whatever that thing is. The problem is, even as we develop these things that are good, we're finding that we're struggling to put together truly end-to-end integrated solutions because we can't integrate with each other. So I saw an opportunity to start to drive innovation within the security culture. And so I figured the best way to do that was start having honest conversations with the security industry that I could scale. And I wasn't going to be able to do that going from city to city to city and trying to go to Ruth Chris Steakhouse with everyone. I would go bankrupt, and
Yes.
plus my belt line wouldn't take it. But what can I do? Well, I can pay $250 a year for a LinkedIn Premium subscription, start putting my ideas, on digital paper and pushing them out and challenging some thoughts and perceptions. Because what happens then is it starts to normalize thought. And that's not to say that every thought that gets pushed out on LinkedIn or the socials about security is going to be the big epiphany or the insightful whatever. But it means that the stuff is available. And with that, yes, there will come some noise. And I'm sure that some would even argue that a lot of what I put out isn't real security content and it's just noise. But I can say this, I've started to normalize some things within the security industry where people call me and say, thank you for being an example and normalizing some of this so that I can share my authentic voice. Because I can tell you that, 3-4 years ago, when I would put a picture of me working out on the hill and then saying, oh, you need to be able to climb a flight of stairs if you're in security. So I'm out here, doing the grind and doing stuff that like had mainstream appeal. It's like, well, that's not really security content. A lot of security folks are putting out that running content and that hiking content now. So it's like, you're welcome, right? But we should be able to do that in a lot of different areas and then tie that back into the value of being a holistic security professional. You're mentally acute, you're physically fit, you're thinking forward, you're asking hard questions of yourself and not just giving canned answers because that's what the current business model allows. It's like, yeah, but are we really addressing this thing? And how do we shift the business model to address that thing and increase the level of service for the people involved? And then the other big thing too, I talk about mainstreaming the security industry and social media content. So I looked at the veteran and military genre on social media in particular. And not to say that there's not some noise and nonsense out there, especially lately, there's been like a little bit of drama and like kind of the special operations creator community. But you look, there's some very big podcasts out there that reach broad audiences, right? But they're not just having their, Sean Ryan's he started out having his special operations buddies come in and talk about, this mission that they were on and, they're flying in helicopters and doing all this, action movie type of stuff. But then he started to talk about other issues, whether it's mental health or having people come in to talk about political issues and technology and psychedelics and remote viewing and just all of this different stuff. Not to say some of it's not wacky, it is. But the point is you're putting it out into the zeitgeist so that people can think about it. So it's breaking down some of those taboos so that people can think about things more fully and then make their own opinions about those types of things. So we see that there's some very big military, ex-military veteran type of content creators, and that's already transcended LinkedIn. And the same thing with podcasts. Some of the biggest podcasts in the world are military inspired podcasts that have branched over into the mainstream. So what I'm trying to do in a small way is get the security industry out of the backwater a little bit and into the mainstream. Because, it used to be, well, we had the biggest companies in the world, but we didn't want anyone to know who we were. I worked for a very large company. My family could never remember the name of it. It's one of the biggest employers in the world by headcount. Or when I was in like a new social circle or cocktail hour or something, well, what do you do for a living, Tyler? Like going out for, a group with my wife or something like that. It's like, well, I work in security. First thing they're going to say is, so like cybersecurity? That's the first thing they're going to say. So that tells me that there's kind of a lack of education and outreach that's happening to non-security people. And non-security people, newsflash, they're our consumers. So we're doing a great job of posting our great opportunity, and I'm honored to be at this banquet and get this award. And then all the other security people say, oh yeah, that's great. It's like, yeah, but we're not reaching anyone outside of our community. So we talk about these silos that we're trying to break all the time, but how are we actually doing that? So I started to do that, and I can tell you that I didn't get a lot of love from the security industry. And even now it's about 20% of my network on views. And it's even less than that on engagement. I think a lot of people read my stuff, but won't click the like button. But if I have doctors, lawyers, attorneys, soccer moms, engineers, politicians, all these other people are like, Dang, Tyler, you really got me thinking about this. And I had to gradually move into that. But now you're hardly ever going to find a hook line of mine. Even at the top of the post, I'm up front, hashtag security industry. So it's there and it's bright. And guess what? People not in that industry are still looking at it because they're applying it to their industry. It's like, well, here's what we're doing in manufacturing, or here's what we're doing in HR and these other things. And that's where you start to see those lines of connection. And the other thing, too, is if we can actually scale security industry social media content, which again, there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram to military. And there's a lot of cool jobs that we do. And obviously you can't talk about everything. It's no different than military operations, but you can give people a sense for the importance of the work and the dedicated professionals that do it, what their mindset is like in certain situations. Maybe it's an emergency or disaster response. Maybe it's like a hostile termination, or maybe it's something like you have a conflict within healthcare and it's like, well, what was going through my mind as this was happening? And here's the things that I was doing to triage that situation and respond to it with and minimize damage or harm to anyone involved in the process. When we start to tell those stories, they have broader appeal and it gets other people engaged with our industry. And if more people outside of our industry know about what we do, that helps us all, one, on exposure, then two, access, and then three, it helps us commercially. If people are looking at security companies saying, dang, that's really cool, that's how we get people interested. And now we get back to someone like your son, who's super tech savvy and he's really into this stuff and he has these expectations for these things. Where are they consuming information? They're consuming it on social media and they're consuming it in podcasts. We start to meet them where they are because we're still trying to send out the facts saying people just don't want to work anymore, but we need to hire more people and do it on Indeed. I think a lot of Gen Z probably doesn't even go on Indeed.
Oh no, probably not.
It's
Definitely
like, so
not.
what? And so what are we doing? And if it's not an
Yeah.
easy apply job, they're going to move on just because. And it's not because they're lazy. It's because if it takes more than 2 minutes and I have to go through and I have to fill all these fields and stuff and 300 other people are going to do it, what's the ROI on that for me? So I think organizations even need to look at that. It's like, how do you make the application process as seamless as possible? But how do you get that message and that storytelling out to those people?
Yeah, no, and you're I laugh because I roped my daughter. She's a freshman in high school. I roped her into sharing my podcast, and now I have like four of her friends that have subscribed on YouTube. And so you're saying this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope maybe they kind of start seeing some of these episodes, and kind of having maybe an
Maybe I'll get
interest.
some followers on LinkedIn off it. It's like, this guy is
Yeah,
not talking nonsense. He's
yeah,
speaking my language, or at least he's an old guy who's trying to anyway. But
yeah. I think the younger generation, they do kind of listen to us. They roll their eyes, but I
right.
do think there is some stuff sinking in, and I think these types of conversations, opening that up, really does help. In fact, I had another high school student. I met with him. Actually, I did a Zoom call with him. He's new to LinkedIn, and he has an interest in healthcare and then also security. He comes from a law enforcement family, but then also wants to be a PA. And so he
Hmm.
saw one of the posts of Eric Sean Clay, who's the current president of IAHSS,
Hmm.
comment on my launch for the podcast. And then he reached out to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And this is exactly like what I was hoping for a platform like this, for a podcast. Reaching out is reaching one, a younger generation, two, bridging kind of that nursing and clinical and security, and going back to like that root cause analysis, right? So a lot of security issues can really, if you look at that root cause analysis, go back to an actual clinical thing that the patient is doing, dealing with. And so bringing more of that security education to nursing to help them understand, these clinical, medical issues are impacting that workplace violence, right? This is your
Right.
root cause, and this is why it's impacting us. And so it's great that we, have the visitor check-in, and that we have the weapons scanning systems and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, that stuff is actually really a small minute problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? The larger problem is the medical issues that patients are dealing with, the stress that's on the family. And that's where that human interaction comes from. And that's where, understanding that and putting that in that organizational
Mm-hmm.
process, right? And you talked about how it's like, this is your lane, this is your lane, this is your lane, you're only going to work in your lane, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you totally miss the root cause analysis and understanding that it impacts all the lanes, right? And you've
Right.
got to have that multidisciplinary collaboration, or else you're
Mm-hmm.
just not going to have successful outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once you have that attention too of an audience like that who's interested in kind of like the cross-functional exchange and how these things are all connected within a digital ecosystem and then also an actual ecosystem of treating people and providing security services or whatever is once we get once we get attention of that target audience, it's fleeting, it goes fast. So you need to grab it, and you do that by talking with them, not talking at them.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you get that audience and you come out with basically a company internal memo and you're posting it on social media and calling it content, you know what's going to happen? 10 to 15 people from the company that posted are going to like it because they feel like they're going to have to, and no one else is going to care about it. That's what's going to happen. And that quickly, you lose them. Unless you talk about something that they can really relate to themselves and why it matters. Because I will say this, with the generations that are coming up now, because they have access to so much information, not to say that it doesn't come without some baggage and, TikTok brain or all this other stuff, but they have a much broader perspective of the world. Now, again, there's misinformation. There are a lot of other things out there, but they have a broader worldview and they've been indoctrinated that from youth. Whereas
Yeah.
I was super sheltered, and even after I went to the army, you're still kind of sheltered within a subculture, and it takes a long time to get out of that. So we need to be a little bit more informed and holistic in how we think about the world and how different things interact and affect our daily lives because they're thinking about it that way.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that they do not have a siloed outlook on
No.
life at all whatsoever. With
Mm-mm.
with the amount of information and content that they can consume and flip between all those different genres so quickly, they
Yep.
do not have a siloed outlook on life, like at all whatsoever. It's honestly like really exciting. The more we kind of talk about it, I'm like, you know what? I can't kind of wait for those new generations of nurses and
Yeah.
and and for them to really start entering the workforce and to really incorporate their viewpoints. And you can't really have innovation unless you're willing to look at that the root cause, and you're willing to break out of that mindset, that silo mindset. You could sort of maybe have innovation like inside that silo, but for true innovation, you really have to be able to look outside that and kind of break down those barriers and break down those walls and have a lot of those tough conversations that you're having. I When you talk about like mental health, I look at my nursing community, and we don't have the mental health support that like military now has.
Mm-hmm.
Law enforcement is even, they have their peer groups, and I know there's still like a bit of a stigma there, but even like law enforcement is years ahead of where nursing is as far
Mm-hmm.
as addressing the stigma of mental health. Even physicians, I mean, there's some stats I've seen, like there's one physician a day that is, committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just at such an alarming, nobody should feel like their job or their profession is holding them in a situation where they feel helpless and they can't get out. And
Yeah, exactly. And even think about like take it a step further, even like beyond like healthcare and nursing. Think about like the wildfires in California right now. There's going to be all these utility workers out there that are going to be doing all this stuff and seeing a lot of stuff. And no one's probably even ever thought about how do we have like post traumatic stress type of training or, therapeutic help or counseling, things like that for people that's tailored to power utilities. But
Yeah.
in a way, when you're responding to disasters like that, it's not so different than like a kinetic or combat type of experience, right? So
Yeah.
there's just all these layers to it. And it's like we're all a bit more connected than we all
Then
think.
we,
So,
yeah, well, and our mutual connection, Clayton, who posted, his experience of, responding to a call that he was out on, and there was domestic violence involved, and
mm-hmm,
he felt like he was ill-equipped to handle that situation, didn't know what he was supposed to do, which is a
right.
very prevalent situation. I mean, even in security and in healthcare, I know for a fact that people are coming into those situations much more than probably what is even talked
Oh my
about.
goodness, like domestic violence type of stuff and those types of things trickle into work settings all the time. I can say even when I was back in guarding, I can't tell you how many times, like with industrial settings in particular, for whatever reason, like manufacturing sites or distribution centers and stuff like that, you'd have a call for like additional security because you have an employer there and them and their spouse are having problems, and the spouse is now sitting in the parking lot or making threats and all, or doing stuff on social media. And it's like, again, those things can trickle in pretty quickly. And it's like, yeah, people call and they just really don't know what to do.
Yeah, no, I have not. I have yet to see any training for security around that, or in any conversations on really like how do you handle this, what do you do, when this happens. I know we do have a lot of conversations about it in healthcare because it is pretty prevalent,
Mm-hmm.
in healthcare, just between staff and then also patient situations.
Mm-hmm.
So from the healthcare security side of things, there's definitely a lot more conversations, but not enough. I mean, across the board, it really is, something that could definitely be talked about, and also provide better training for, and more
Right.
specific training. I mean, I think you could make a whole day training out of it, to be honest.
Well, and over time, you start to get into analytics where you can start to get the triggers. It's like, this person said this thing, or this is the thing that's happening, to where you can kind of start to heat map those. I mean, obviously, there's privacy considerations around a lot. So it's a very nuanced conversation. But, at the end of the year, that that, of 10 people that got punched in the mouth in the hospital, 15 was all for relatively the same root reason. It's like, maybe we should look at some control measures for that reason, where 15 of those 100 people got punched in the mouth, if that's such a common reason for it happening.
Yes, and that is one of the things, that's one of my pet peeves about a lot of these reporting systems that we use in the hospital. So like, as staff, we're supposed to go in and report, anytime there's like a workplace violence,
Mm-hmm.
event. And a lot of times those reporting systems don't really get to the root cause. And I
Right.
think, and there's not always like a lot of follow up. So you're going in there and you're like, yeah, it was a verbal, and you're writing out kind of the whole like description type thing. But if you're not, especially depending on when you sit down and really fill it out, and
Right.
I think there needs to be a lot more guidance there, because
Right.
the person that's in the situation might not necessarily be in tune or cued to, maybe that was kind of the root cause, right? So having more of like those conversations and actually being interviewed, after each event, and
Right.
not just going in and like clicking, like here's all my click boxes, and then nothing happens with it, which I think is a
Well, I mean,
complaint.
it's a repository. It's basically a repository or a system of record, more or less. But there's not any follow-on analysis. But again, so if you have 100 instances that happen over the course of a year where people get punched in the mouth, but there's some sort of, whether it's an AI overlay or basic machine learning or something like that, that starts to ping. It's like, well, we've passed 5 where all of these inputs were the same for the getting punched in the mouth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then they start to say, well, hey, ding, 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 sister, or, hospital administrator. A lot of people are getting punched in the mouth over 3 parking spots that are in 3 handicap parking spots. And not to oversimplify it, but maybe it is
Right.
a matter of, maybe there needs to be 6 handicap parking spots. And if 15 people are getting punched in the mouth just because they're fighting over a handicap parking spot, right?
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. And you bring up AI doing that. Like, that's another, exciting. I think there was actually just a study released where somebody used AI to pull nursing charting, and kind of look at all of that and find those overlaps and those similarities and kind of being able to map out a little bit better. I think the workplace violence and the situations that nurses were finding themselves in, because nurses will chart it all day long. You can't see it on my camera, but I have another little thing up there that says, but did you document it?
Right.
And so, we're really good at like doing that and going in and documenting all of that and freehanding all of our notes in there. And so you talk about that automation and making processes, more streamlined, using something like AI to be able to pull all of those charts and look at all of those incidences. Definitely speeds up the process, because right now there is not the manpower to sit there and do an interview for every single person that is filling out these reports. It would just it would be inundated and overwhelming. So to implement something like that across the board would be amazing.
And the thing too is that even if you do, because security is kind of the same way, like, well, did you write a report for it? And is the report good? And there's so much training that happens because a security officer did a crappy report. And rightfully so. We want a good report that says the who, what, when, where, why, how, and, all the details of it and who was involved and whatever. And yeah, there's only so much depth you can probably put into an investigation, particularly if it's something that's a bit more routine. But then on top of that, so, okay, the nurse got the report, and maybe it wasn't in depth, maybe it was, depending on what it is, or you got the report from the security officer, maybe it was a good report. How often does a manager go back and just pine through a bunch of past incident reports to say, oh, I see a correlation here? They're not doing that because they're busy working on what's happening right now, and are they going to have someone to fill this shift, and now they're having a dispute between two employees, or a parking lot's closed off and we need to figure out where all the employees are going to park, and all this other stuff that no one's going back and doing, after the fact, deep analysis of all this data. It's sitting there.
Well, and I'm just thinking about just like even, C-suite in hospitals, they're wearing multiple hats. I mean, a lot of them are managing multiple departments. They have a lot of load on their plates, and dealing with all of that. So
that's American work culture too. I'm confident that 99% of people that are in a job aren't just sitting around being lazy doing nothing. I think we are some of the busiest people on the planet, right? And we take the least time off and all of that stuff. And it's like, again, we pick up all these other jobs and we're doing this other stuff and we get roped into these special projects and we get scope creeped into stuff. But yeah, like deep analysis of stuff just doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. And speaking of taking time off and kind of going back to what we started with, your mountaineering and your hobbies. I'm kind of curious, if you share some stories around that, and then you even talked about how it made you a better coworker, made you have kind of a better outlook from a professional side. So I'm curious, like, what is a memorable, from a mountaineering experience that you had? What's memorable, and then did it actually have some implication into your professional life as well?
So I'll start with how I got started into mountaineering, which was at 37 years old, right? So I didn't start young. I didn't grow up in the mountains. I live in Minnesota, which is outdoorsy and all that, but it's not a mountainous state by any stretch. So I didn't know anyone that climbed mountains. So I was still in the Army Reserves at that time. I transitioned from the Guard to the Reserves, and we were sitting in a class called Master Resiliency Training. And it's a program that the Army does where it's kind of like a combination of sports psychology and stuff like that to, it's mindset stuff. So, I mean, it's a good program, and I'm sure it's evolved over the years as well. But in any case, we were, me and some like mid to senior level managers are in our unit were sitting in this training, and the instructor was facilitating the class. And one of the things we had to do is just go around the room and say, hey, what's your dream? One of my buddies said, I want to climb a mountain someday. And so I went away from that experience, and I couldn't get it out of I had said something else. I think it's like, I want to get promoted to VP, because that's where my mind was at that point, right?
Yep.
I want to get promoted to VP within my company, and make more money and have more impact, blah, 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 right? And I went away from that and I was thinking, because he said someday. And then after that, I noticed other people were saying their thing. Like another buddy said, I want to run a marathon someday. And that someday was bothering me. And it's like, you know what? Someday is the killer of hopes and dreams, because that's what people use as a way to rationalize why they're not doing it now, but they'll get around to it, and then they never get around to it, especially on those big things. So whether it's personal, lifetime achievement, or it's, a career goal or whatever. And so I couldn't shake it, and I started researching climbing mountains. And I write about this in my book, so I'm not going to share all of it here.
Okay.
But basically where we arrived at this was put together a plan, and we went and did it. And afterwards, this guy's like, I always wanted to climb a mountain. I'm like, yeah, that's why we're here. It's like, I don't think he put the two together because enough time had passed between. And it's like, I knew that I changed his perspective, and he's gone on and climbed afterwards, and some of the other guys have as well. And since then, I've made attempts on, and that was the second highest peak in the contiguous US. So it's Mount Elbert, not super technical, but tall, right?
Yes. Yep.
So kind of a good starting point, the gentle giant. But I'm like, well, why can't I climb all 10? Within a month, me and one of the guys from that original group, we were summiting Mount Whitney right before the snow rolled in for the winter. So within the period of a month, a 37-year-old, I had gone from never climbing a mountain, didn't know anything about it, going through the research and made a lot of mistakes. But within 2 months, we climbed the first and second tallest mountains in the lower 48. So I decided, well, I want to climb the 10 highest. That's still a work in progress. And I've actually failed on 3 of those peaks, a total of 6 times between 3 peaks. So I've got a fair share of failures on these, but I've summited 7 of the 10. And that's something that I just started doing. One, it was to help a buddy fulfill a dream. And then I was hooked because it gave me confidence and it gave me an outlet for these types of things. And it's like, those are the types of things, those are the credentials that I can still put that on a resume. I can still talk about on LinkedIn. And guess what? It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about me, whether they think about my man guarding philosophies or whatever. You can look at me and see my body of work, and not only what organizations granted to me. It's like, well, this is a dude that's gone out and he's sought education, he's sought out certificates, he's actively participating in the public conversation through LinkedIn, which is getting him into journal articles, and he's also climbing mountains and doing some other stuff. So I think that there are a lot of different ways now to, measure your salt and show that to the world. That's just beyond, well, maybe if I wait in line for 5 years, maybe my boss will retire and they won't go with an outside hire and they'll hire me. Because I think that's the situation a lot of people are in. There are a lot of other ways to build that compounding interest, for yourself. And I think personal and professional, it doesn't matter. I think a lot of it's the same, especially if you're a high achiever. I can tell you, I've gone into job interviews with, all my project management stuff, all my security stuff or whatever. And I've climbed some of the 10 highest mountains in the US. One bullet point on the resume. Guess what 15 minutes of that hour conversation's about, right?
That. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's ways to differentiate yourself. That's not purely, well, I'm differentiated because I'm a problem solver and I saved the company $10,000 and the other candidate only saved the company $8,000. It's like, maybe that's true, but it's showing that, demonstrating that I'm willing to put it out on a shingle and solve real problems and go do some other stuff that's still measurable. And I'm not just saying I'm awesome, you should hire me because, I can save you this much money. And a lot of employers will never be able to verify that. But guess what? I've got that summit pick. Can't deny it. It's there. I did it. I put in the work. I put together the plan. I leveraged project management. I assessed risk. I did all of those things and I made it happen. I operationalized a plan. So that's kind of in a nutshell how the mountaineering falls into the security stuff.
Yeah, no, I think it's so applicable. I mean, and just, you don't have to explain all that stuff, right? On your resume, it's just a bullet point. I've climbed, the 3 highest mountains, right? But you talk about, I had to do the risk assessment, I had to put the project management in, and I think people can see that, right? Employers,
Mm-hmm.
when you're going for those conversations or even prospective contracts, that kind of stuff, that's all you need to put on there, because people fill in the blanks, right? Their minds fill in the blanks of it takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of hard work to be able to climb, those mountains. And so I think it speaks volume to your character, and then your ability to do
Right.
things, right? And so
Right.
just getting out there and doing that. And so I think that's an important conversation, and one that you are having on LinkedIn is all of
Hmm.
these other diverse parts of maybe your personal life, put those out there because they do help show that you're overcoming things, or you're resilient, or you have some knowledge to be able to do those things. Like for me, I got my black belt in taekwondo, right? That's actually
Hmm.
what was like my trajectory into kind of this safety and security world. It was always kind of in the back of my mind, but I hadn't really thought it or even given it a second thought until I started training taekwondo. And that's was my exposure to self-defense and safety and security and situational awareness and kind of all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, I can say, you know what, after 5 years of training, I got my black belt. And
Right.
and that really speaks volumes to a lot of people, because they know that that's not an easy feat, an easy thing to do, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it took a lot of fortitude to stay within. You're starting at square one with no context, so it shows that you're also willing to function outside of your comfort zone and be completely new to something. And I think that that's especially as important as we progress in our careers. And you know, maybe we're the stuff at this one thing that we've done for 10 years, but how much other stuff have you done? Because you see that too, where people, they're in the same thing for 10 or 15 years. And I'm not going to say exclusively, but those tend to be the people who talk a lot about innovation, but they don't really ever do anything differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of wrapping this up because we've covered a lot of ground here, I think, today.
Yeah, hopefully we
So,
solved all the world's problems. And if everyone,
right?
if everyone will just listen to us and listen to your show every week, they'll have all the answers.
There you go. One could only hope. I've never aspired to have all the answers, but I definitely aspire to connect people to other people that have the answers. That is
Right.
definitely what I aspire to. So,
I'm gonna share a secret with you real quick. So
okay.
I went through a State Department high threat diplomatic security program. Again, very good training outside of the military, just through the course of doing things. But one of the things that the instructors would always say, because like there were a few training evolutions where we had like an inject and we all got kind of discombobulated a little bit, and we ended up screwing up the evolution and kind of had to do a retraining and start over or whatever. But this guy, he goes, boys, boys, boys. The first rule of executive protection and diplomatic security, even if you have no idea what the F is going on, always look cool. Roger that.
Well, and I totally agree. No, I do. But you can look cool and kind of say, I don't have the answer, but I'll get you the person that does, right?
Right,
And I feel
right.
like you look competent at that point too, and
Yeah,
knowing your limits and everything. So I love that.
yeah, absolutely.
You may not know what's
Yeah.
going on, but just
Yeah,
make sure you look
don't
cool.
let people freak out, especially if you have people that are counting on you. But yeah, just be upfront with it and say, yeah, I don't know, but let's figure this out. Because again, I've seen too many people that well, let's take it offline. It's like, just say you don't know. How about instead of we'll take this offline because I'm supposed to know everything and I don't know something, just say, how about you share that for the benefit of the group, myself included. It's much classier, and guess what? You can get it sorted out right there.
Yep. Yep. That is awesome. Well, do you have any closing thoughts or
Oh boy.
anything that you would like to leave the audience with?
Oh boy. I don't know. Maybe I left them with too much already.
No, you were great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I mean,
Me too.
you kept it going, and it had a lot to share, and I know I learned a lot today. And so I
Yeah,
really
likewise.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
And
I like what you're doing here, and kind of, letting people see the fusion of things. It's such a novel concept to talk about healthcare from the perspective of nursing, and how that kind of interplay works between those two things. And hopefully it'll kind of get other people thinking about that as well. So maybe we'll see more of that, like security in manufacturing, security in distribution, security in some of these areas that aren't as obvious, that maybe there's still that risk and threat profile there that's, we really need to be having conversations about and thinking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'm trying to kind of figure out the wording because like thought leader, have you ever seen,
Ah.
no, no, I know, but have you ever,
Oh boy.
no, I know, and we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but have you seen,
And influencer, thought leader and influencer,
yeah,
yes.
influencer thought,
I have a very interesting relationship with those two terms.
well, and one of my favorite movies actually that just it came out a little while ago is the Knives Out, the Glass Onion. Have you seen that movie yet?
I think my wife watched it. I passed on that one.
Oh, it's a good movie because in it, oh my gosh, I cannot think of the name of the actors, but he talks about being a thought disruptor. He's like, we're all disruptors. We disrupted this and we disrupted that, and it's a pretty witty movie. It's got some good intellectual wittiness to it, and I've been kind of thinking, I don't know if I necessarily consider myself a thought leader, but definitely I've always been a disruptor and challenging kind of the status quo.
The
And
term I like to use for it is thought provocateur. I think
oh, there you go.
the thought provocateurs come before the thought leaders, and they're the ones that put the idea out when nobody's ready for it. And so they're the person that everyone gets ticked off at and doesn't like their post. And then in 3 to 5 years, all the thought leaders start talking about the thing that the thought provocateur was talking about.
Or taboo, right? Thought
Right,
taboo.
right,
I'm a
exactly.
taboo thought leader.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
So,
or being a disruptor. Everyone wants to be a disruptor till they realize that it's pretty lonely.
yes, yeah. Yeah, no, it really is. It can be. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for taking some time out.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And yeah, I appreciate it. And we'll keep conversations going. And we hope you tune in and listen and also follow. Oh, Tyler, how do people get a
Thank
hold of you? How do
you.
they
Thank
follow you?
you.
I
Thank you.
got it.
Thank
I got it. I
you.
was going there.
Shameless self promotion now. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. I have an Instagram if you're on there and not on LinkedIn. So for messaging purposes, I really don't put out much content there, but I put out daily content on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me, reach out, connection request, if you're so inclined to do that. I also have a multimedia page. It's Tyler Schmoker Multimedia. Type it into Google, you'll be able to find it. It's got a consolidated list of all my podcast episodes, which the security nurse will be going into. And so you can find that. You can find my publications, things that I've done in media, those articles and things like that. And then last but not least, my company and how I make a living. It is Winsley. So that's www.winsley, WINSLY, LLC.com. And it is where management consulting meets security. So if you're looking for a different view on your security program from a management consultant perspective, reach out. I'd be happy to work with you.
There you have it. All right. Awesome, Tyler. And we hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.